Hello everybody. Welcome to another day on research areas. Did you know, guys, I'm so happy today because of your love and appreciation. My video on cultural studies has reached 100k for the first time. I never got 100k ever. Thank you so much. Video on cultural studies. Have you watched it? Thank you so much. So, are you ready to talk about queer and disability studies? Let us start. Queer studies. I am just giving you a very basic overview. We are not going into all the details because this is only an overview video. And my main aim is to give you the names of the authors, works, theorists, in case you are researching on this already. Okay? So it is up to the researcher to read and find out all the basic things. You have to read the books. So there is no point in spoon feeding a researcher. So I have not prepared along those lines. My aim is to motivate you and give you some basic understanding in case you're a beginner. And in case you're an advanced learner, I will share with you names of some important books. What is queer studies? Queer studies is also called sexual diversity studies. In the past, we never talked about sexual diversity. We talked about the sexual binary. But today, we don't talk about the binary, sexual diversity studies or LGBT studies. It is, as many of you would know, the study of issues related to sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is not a simple thing. It is something in a state of flux. And it is not to be imposed upon a person. So compulsory sexuality is an obsolete idea these days. What is the sexual orientation of a person? It is up to the person to decide. It has nothing to do with the society. So things have changed a lot from the past. And what is the difference between sexuality and gender? That is a very basic idea in queer studies. Sexuality is what queer studies people prefer to talk about because gender is a construct. Gender is a social construct. The focus of LGBT studies is on lesbian, gay, bisexual, asexual, queer studies, questioning intersex people and cultures. Now, the term queer was originally derogatory. It has changed today. Originally, the term queer stigmatized male same-sex love and female same-sex love as deviant and unnatural. It is called homophobia. But today, since the early 1990s, it has been adopted, the term queer has been adopted by lesbians and gay people themselves as a non-derogatory term to identify a way of life. Queer is a way of life, and queer is also an area for scholarly inquiry. So queer is now a very positive term. Okay, now originally it was centered on LGBT history and literary theory. Originally, queer studies talked only about LGBT history and literary theory. But queer studies has expanded. It is now a discipline that has expanded into archaeology, sociology, psychiatry, anthropology, the history of science, philosophy. In any of these combinations, you can do your research. You can write research papers or write a research proposal and join for a PhD program based on any of these combinations. Psychology, sexology, political science, ethics. So many areas have joined hands with queer studies. It is now highly interdisciplinary. And you can examine very basic issues like identity, lifestyle, history, perception, representation, and so on and so forth. Queer studies and space studies, queer studies in the perception of political studies or ethnography, so on and so forth. So, when you do a research project, read about queer studies in general and also identify possible areas in which you can club queer studies with any of these other disciplines and then read more about it. Once you're confident and interested, then you should embark into a quest, a research. Now, queer studies is studied in universities. The first undergraduate course in the United States was in 1970 on LGBTIQ studies. It was in the University of California in Berkeley. Since then, there has been many courses that have started on queer studies across the world. And queer studies is a very burgeoning area for research. Now, queer studies is a little different from queer theory. Queer theory is a field of critical theory that emerged in the 1990s. Earlier, queer studies or gay and lesbian studies only was there. Then, queer studies joined hands with LGBTQ studies and women studies also. Today, women's studies is kind of incomplete if it doesn't join hands with queer studies. A number of queer theorists have adopted the deconstructive approach, dismantling the binary oppositions. Because in a binary opposition, one is always the privileged term. So in deconstruction, we always move beyond the binary oppositions. We talk about a plural identity. It can be applied to a variety of areas. It can be applied to queer studies in the context of race, queer studies in the context of post-colonialism, queer studies in the context of disability, queer studies in the context of subaltern identity like Dalits or natives, native queer, aboriginal queer. So, queer studies is not a limited term. It is everywhere. It is there in everything. So it is a component that you can add to any of your research projects in any discipline. So it's as vast as that. The informal term of the term queer theory began with Gloria Anzaldúa. You might know that Gloria Anzaldúa is a Chicano-American, very major writer and feminist also. She has given a new thrust in queer theory. They were all influenced by, she and the 1990s theorists have been influenced by obviously Michel Foucault, who has talked about sexuality and queering identities in very unique ways. So when you study queer studies for research, definitely you start from Michel Foucault. You have to read from there. Queer reading has become a term for interpretive activities. How to read anything from a queer perspective. Queer reading has become the term for interpretive activities or interpretation that undertake to subvert and confound established ideas. Established ideas are questioned in queer reading. Established ideas, oppositions, and boundaries are interrogated and negated and questioned in queer reading. That is a very important aspect of queer studies, because queer studies is not only about queer protagonists or queer narratives. It is also about reading mainstream works from a queer perspective. So that is very important. In mainstream, so-called mainstream perspectives, there was a lot of compartmentalization and cultural opposition between male and female, homosexual and heterosexual, normal and abnormal. What is normal and what is abnormal is redefined when you look at it from the perspective of queer studies. So within queer studies, there are very important areas. Queer studies intersects with gender studies. The concept of gender and gender studies has changed considerably. We understand gender as fluid and in a state of flux these days. There are areas like transgender studies and transgender literature. Transgender studies is about larger aspects of culture. It is not only about literature. Transgender literature involves testimonials and memoirs and all kinds of representative literature and narratives. Then we have queer reading. Even if you're not focusing on queer narratives, you can also focus on queer reading, like a feminist reading. Digital transgender studies is a very major area these days. In any aspect of identity, you can club digital studies. You can club technological studies, and any aspect of culture or identity. So digital trans studies is there. Then lesbian and gay studies. Trans ecology and trans ecology is looking at ecological aspects, environmental aspects from a trans perspective. And transgender rights. These are all very exciting areas which have brought in very many new perspectives. So please read about all these areas, explore more. It will give you a lot of new ideas for research and PhD. Now, many of you would know all these names. They are all very famous names. Major theorists like Eve Kosofsky, Sedgwick, the author of Epistemology of the Closet. I'm sure all of you know that. Michael Warner, Lawrence Burl, and even if you're not doing research in queer studies or any of these like medical humanities, etc., it would still be worthwhile being students of cultural studies. It would be worthwhile to do your own reading based on these writers. Please save these names. I will post in the Telegram group these PDFs. Please save these names and read up, make your own notes about them, and it will make a very awesome culture studies material, study material for you yourself. And when you do research papers, etc., you can just draw upon these ideas and authors and use them appropriately in your research papers. So these are the major theorists. Some of them are very familiar, like Judith Butler, Adrienne Rich, David Halperin. I myself have talked about them in my videos before also, some of them at least. John Boswell, Martin Duberman, and Ellis Hansen. So these are very major theorists. And they have talked about how queer identities are constructed and how queer narratives are how they represent queer experiences and lives, and how queer reading of mainstream culture has brought in new approaches, and also looking at any aspect of culture from the point of view of queer studies is a very enriching experience. As for example, they have looked at many concepts like motherhood, for example, family, the human body, the theme of confidence culture, we call today's culture. I think I've talked about that before also. So how is it changing? Celebrity culture, how is it changing? Concept of beauty, how is it changing? So what are the parameters of queer narratives and queer representation? They have developed theories on numerous aspects of queer studies. Similarly, the books, very major books that anybody should know if you are a student of queer studies, I have put here: Epistemology of the Closet, Queer Studies, a Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual and Transgender Anthology. At least some of these we should have in our library also, because it looks very politically incorrect these days. If you have a lot of books in your library but you don't have any books on queer studies, it looks very strange. In fact, A Critical Introduction to Queer Theory, The Queer Art of Failure, the Routledge Queer Studies Reader. There are so many articles and very useful perspectives that you will get from many of these books. In fact, Trans Studies, then after queer studies, Literature, Theory and Sexuality in the 21st century. So what is after queer studies? That is what it explores. And there's a Cambridge Companion to Queer Studies. Did you know that? Cambridge Companions, what are the various Cambridge Companions, etc. You might even be required to know in NET exam. So make a note of these readings. This is not a course. This usually, there are many 5-day courses that I've conducted. This 5-day course on research areas is not for spoon feeding. Research scholars do not need any spoon feeding. I'm not going to teach you anything. I am just like a research supervisor or a guide. I'm just giving you directions so that you can explore it on your own. Okay? This is not a usual kind of course where I will explain concepts and help you understand for exams, etc. Because this is not for an exam particularly. I'm just giving you some directions. Now some questions that are interesting, and you might, be able to get a better idea with these questions also. Would you like to answer some of them? Which of the following is not a possible area of research in queer studies? Tell me. Which of the following is not an area of queer studies? Coming out of the closet, professional athletes from the LGBT community. Is it part of queer studies? The psychology of homophobia, the Stonewall riots, the history of science fiction movies. Tell me which of these is not under the purview of queer studies? It is, of course, the history of science fiction movies. The history of science fiction movies. Very good. Which of the following works is not written by Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick? This is why I did not mention her books. Which of the following is not written by Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick? Of course, you know this one. It is Epistemology of the Closet is by Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick. Between Men is by Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick. Sexual Politics, of course, is by Kate Millett. Tendencies, have you heard of that one? Tendencies is by Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick. Now, what is the subtitle of Judith Butler's Bodies That Matter? What is the subtitle of Judith Butler's Bodies That Matter? Bodies That Matter on the Discursive Limits of Sex. Bodies That Matter on the Discursive Limits of Sex. Of course, that can be a net or set question. I hope you will remember that one. Which of the following journals is not associated with queer studies? This question also can be net or set question. Transgender Studies Quarterly, GLQ, Sexualities, Screen. Which of the following journals is not associated with queer studies? Bolo. Of course, it is Screen. It's a very famous journal of film studies. Screen is a very famous journal of film studies. Then, who wrote 100 years of homosexuality in ancient Greece? 100 Years of Homosexuality is a book about homosexuality in ancient Greece. 100 Years of Homosexuality. Is it John J. Wingler, David M. Halperin, Mildred Berryman, John Boswell? It is a very famous book by David M. Halperin. David M. Halperin wrote 100 Years of Homosexuality. So that was a small, brief introduction to queer studies. This will help you in NET and SET also. Now we are going into disability studies. Will you be with me in talking about disability studies? Bolo, are you ready for disability studies? Ta-da-dang, disability studies is needless to say a very important area as well. What is disability studies? Disability studies is an academic discipline that examines the meaning, nature, and consequences of disability. The meaning of disability. What is disability? What is the meaning of disability? It is an academic discipline that examines the meaning, the nature, and consequences of disability. Are you getting me? Disability studies include work in disability history, disability theory, disability legislation, policy, ethics, and the arts. We talk about all these areas. The history of disability, the theory of disability, the legislation and law related to disability, policy, ethics, and representation of disability in the arts. Getting me, guys? Disability studies, scholarship, and teaching. Scholarship means knowledge. Disability studies, knowledge, and teaching. Enhance the understanding of disability by incorporating social, cultural, historical, legal, and political perspectives. We can talk about disability from social perspective, cultural perspective, historical, legal, and political perspective. Yeah, any book, any narrative where disability is represented through a character can be brought under disability studies. But when we do disability studies, like in olden times, we don't just work on literature. You don't have to take always literary texts, because in cultural studies, you are not always necessarily taking literary texts. It can be any narrative. It can be visual narratives or testimonials or blogs or any narrative. So, disability studies incorporates social, cultural, historical, legal, political perspectives, including the connections between disability and other identities. In the coming years, like I told you yesterday, things are going to change. The nature of professions related to English literature is going to change. You know, universities are changing. With your traditional old kind of approach, you may not fit in the new age of English literature or any education in India. Education in India is changing. So we have to be futuristic. Okay? Now, disability studies emerged in the 1980s, primarily in the US, UK, and Canada. And now I will take you through a timeline of disability studies. In 1986, the section for the study of chronic illness, impairment, and disability of the Social Science Association was renamed the Society for Disability Studies. In 1986, Society for Disability Studies. Yes, Mental disability also is under disability studies. Yes. In her 1998 manifesto, claiming disability, a very famous theorist, Simi Linton, summed up the most important benefits of using the social model. What is the social model for disability? And if you are interested in knowing about it, Claiming Disability is the book. Okay, 1998 Manifesto of Disability Studies it is called. In 2005, the MLA or Modern Language Association established disability studies as a division of study. Now, what does that mean? You can look up. This is also a milestone. Very famous Sharon Snyder and David Mitchell advocated for a cultural model. So there is a social model of disability, cultural model of disability. It explores disabled people's bodies interacting with the societies around them. Psychoanalysis can be applied in any of these queer studies or disability studies also. Tobin Siebers, with his theory of complex embodiment, remember that theory, complex embodiment, positioned disability as a product of both the environment and bodily factors. Disability as a result of chronic pain, disability as a result of secondary health effects, as a result of aging and disability studies you can do. What is critical disability studies? Critical disability studies considers how institutions, cities or societies disable people systematically and socially. So social disability, not only physical or mental, not only physiological, but you can talk about social disability also. It is a larger concept. It looks into how the body and impairment can critically be incorporated into discussions of disability and disablement. In the context of disability, how can you talk about the body and impairment as well as social angles of it? This is a very burgeoning area as well. Now, you can read more on queer disability. This is an intersectional and interdisciplinary field, intersectional field, queer disability. Disability aesthetics. When you talk about aesthetics, when you talk about beauty, when you talk about a beautiful dancer, you never think about disabled people. You think of able-bodiedness. The concept is able-bodiedness. So, what is disability aesthetics is a very interesting and very important area. Crip theory is another very important theory that I have discussed in the past also. Disability studies and medical humanities, like yesterday we were talking about medical humanities. You can combine these two together. You can also combine feminism and disability studies, and also disability studies and environmental humanities. We have just given you a few pointers for your own reading. There is tremendous scope in this area, and so many more ideas will be there, that you will get with your own reading to club different disciplines together. Recommended readings: the famous disability studies reader, An Introduction to Disability Studies, Handbook of Disability Studies. You should follow writers like David Halperin, Leonard J. Davis, etc. Feminist Disability Studies is also a book. Routledge Handbook is there. The Disability Studies, A Student's Guide. Feminist Queer Crip is another book, and Keywords for Disability Studies. I always want to remind you, not possessing some of these books is actually a very criminal thing these days, because we have to talk about queer and disability as part of the mainstream. We have to bring them into the mainstream. So here are some of the major theorists I have not included all. Some of the David Halperin, Leonard J. Davis I will add because I forgot to mention Leonard J. Davis. James Charlton, Nirmala Aravelis, Laura Hershey, Mike Oliver, very famous is Rosemary Garland Thompson. Robert McCrewer is associated with our crib theory that I mentioned. Robert McCrewer, Tom Shakespeare. Please read up these theorists and you will get very important ideas. Of course, it can be a very major area. It is not a topic for PhD. It is an area for PhD. You have to read on a particular area, get to know the basics properly, and then only you can reach a topic. Nobody can give you a research topic. People can only give you a research area. Now, let us look at some interesting questions. Who of the following wrote Extraordinary Bodies, a founding text in the disability studies canon? Extraordinary Bodies, a founding text in the disability studies canon. Is it Bill Hughes, Rosemary Garland Thompson, Mike Oliver, or Irving Zola? Tell me, guys. It is Rosemary Garland Thompson who wrote Extraordinary Bodies. Will you remember? Very important book it is. Extraordinary Bodies by Rosemary Garland Thompson. They will ask in NET, and at that time don't tell me they're asking difficult questions, exam was difficult. Don't say that. These are all very basic things in cultural studies. Which of the following is not a possible area of research in disability studies? Bolo? Women, learning difficulty and identity, a study through life narratives. Is it a possible area of research? Accessibility and inclusive public space. Gender, disability and access to education. Environmental politics and world narratives. Tell me, which of these is not a possible area of research in disability studies? Of course, women learning difficulty is also disability. Learning difficulty is disability. Accessibility and inclusive public space is about disability. How far public space gives accessibility to disabled people. Gender, disability and access to education. Yes, environmental politics is not part of disability studies. Which of the following is a possible area in disability studies? Bolo, which of the following is a possible area of research? Protagonists with autism spectrum disorder in American fiction. Influence of climate fiction. Cricket literature culture. Representation of masculinity in cinema. Of course, it is protagonists with autism. Then, who of the following wrote politics of... 1 minute, guys. Okay. Who of the following wrote Politics of Disablement, a sociological approach? Do you know that? Politics of Disablement, a sociological approach. Have you heard of that book? It is by Mike Oliver. Mike Oliver. Please remember to look up these authors. Which of the following journals is not associated with disability studies? Journal of Learning Disabilities. Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies. Nature and Culture. American Annals of the Deaf. Which of these is not associated with disability studies? Which of these journals? Of course, it is Nature and Culture. Nature and Culture. Okay. So guys, on the 27th of this month, on Sunday, we are going to have a big YouTube event where you can meet 100 people who passed NET. from tests and our classes and videos, etc. Okay, we are bringing them together. And also, tomorrow is the 80th episode of Everyday at 6. And from tomorrow, I am conducting a contest. You have to subscribe to our channel, to this channel, and also you have to comment on all the videos of Everyday at 6, and you're going to get a big prize. Some of you will be chosen for a big prize if you do that. Okay, so just announcing these things. We have come to the end of this session on queer studies and disability studies. I hope you enjoyed it. I have a very bad throat pain today because I was teaching from morning, recording and all that. So I was not in a lot of energetic, fun mode. I'm so sorry for that. I'm feeling a little feverish and throat pain is there. So thank you for joining me today. Please join our contest starting from tomorrow by subscribing and also commenting on Everyday at 6 videos from tomorrow. And also join us on the 27th of March at 8 p.m. for our big felicitation of 100 NET students who passed with the help of tests. Okay, thank you very much. Good night. God bless you. Today's session is ending here. Bye-bye.